Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to day 4 of the AI for Good Global Summit Breakthrough Days. We hope that you, your family, your colleagues, and your friends are all keeping healthy and safe. My name is Fred Werner from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, and it's a privilege for me to introduce today's session. Now, the ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, and we're also the organizers of the AI for Good Global Summit, alongside with XPRIZE Foundation, and in partnership with 37 UN organizations, ACM, and co-convened with Switzerland. And the goal of the summit is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. And like much of the world, the AI Summit has gone digital, and we're moving forward with weekly programming, allowing us to reach even more people than ever before. Now, one might say that the heart of the summit has always been organized around the breakthrough sessions. And here we aim to connect AI innovators with problem owners to generate practical AI for good projects. And this year it's no exception. And we're moving forward with the breakthrough days presented as a series of top-notch keynotes, interactive workshops, project demonstrations, presentations, announcements, and much more. So we hope you enjoy today's sessions and the days to come ahead. Now, before I introduce today's moderator, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping issues. First of all, your microphone has been disabled, so please use the Q&A and chat function if you wish to communicate. It's the role and the responsibility of the moderator to identify questions and ask these questions to the keynotes and the panelists. And we're counting on your active participation to create a very interactive session. And speaking of being interactive, I have a first challenge for you. Can you please let us know where you're connecting from? Simply use the chat function and make sure you mark it chat to everyone and type in what city you're coming from, what country, what organization, or simply say hello. Here, I'll go first. Geneva, Switzerland. Brazil, Los Angeles, Tampa, Florida, Munich, Colombia, Dubai, Dallas, Paris, Helsinki, New Jersey, London. Wow, we truly have a global audience here, which is very fitting for a global summit. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator. His name is Amir Bani-Fatemi, and he's the Chief Information Officer of XPRIZE Foundation. And he's also the chair of the program committee of the AI for Good Global Summit. So I feel very comfortable leaving you in his very capable hands. So Amir, welcome, and the show is all yours.
Thank you very much for the nice welcome, Fred, and hello everyone. And this is a pleasure to be with all of you. This year we have the Global Summit in special circumstances, and we are now used to a digital audience and digital participation. As we have been going through a few days already of the Global Summit, we have learned that participation is key. So we invite you to add your questions. You can use the Q&A and give us questions. Today we have two amazing speakers. I'm going to introduce them shortly. What we have been focusing on really is to identify how AI for Good works in action. And during this time of pandemics, we have learned that, in fact, more people have come to join us and to come up with solutions that would make an impact in the era of pandemics. Today, the theme is more about collaboration and the collective thinking. And this is an important part of AI for Good. And we have learned yesterday and the day before from Stuart Russell and Francesca Rossi, the 5 years of AI for Good and what we have done jointly. So it's without a surprise that my dear friend Yoshua Bengio, who has been with us since day one in 2017 to kickstart this event, have been instrumental in the development of AI for Good. I would like to introduce Yoshua, but before that, let me give a short bio of Yoshua. Yoshua Bengio is recognized as one of the world's leading experts in artificial intelligence and a pioneer in deep learning. In fact, since 1993, he's been a professor at the University of Montreal and CIFAR's Learning and Machine Brain Program Computer Director. He's also the founder and scientific director of MIL, the Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute, the world's largest, in fact, university-based research group in deep learning. And in 2018, Yoshua was ranked as the computer scientist with the most new citations worldwide, thanks to his many high-impact contributions. And last year, in 2019, he received the ACM Turing Award, which is, as we call it, the Nobel Prize of Computing, jointly with Jeffrey Hinton and Jan LeCun, for conceptual and engineering breakthrough that have made deep neural network a critical component of computing. Joshua has a number of recognitions and very involved in various societies. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of London and the Royal Society of Canada, has received a Canada Research Chair and a Canada CFAR AI Chair. He is an officer of the Order of Canada, a member of the NeurIPS Advisory Board, co-founder and member of the board of ICLR Conference, and program director of the CFAR program on learning in machines and brains. But above anything, his goal is to contribute to uncovering the principles giving rise to intelligence through learning, and as well as favoring the development of AI for the benefit of all. We're truly honored to have you with us, Joshua, today. So Joshua, you've been a driving force on AI for Good movement, and even with all your responsibilities, you're still involved in beneficial and responsible AI research and development. And as today, as we're exploring, of course, during these difficult times, the opportunity to drive efforts in our collective well-being, there is a lot of expectation in AI machine learning to drive new solutions and to address pandemics. And you have a special lens from that perspective, and we've seen various efforts. Would you like to share with us how these efforts are indicating a new direction that AI and machine learning can take to help us address global challenges?
All right. Thank you, Amir. It's a tall order. I will share my screen now. So today I thought I would go and give examples of two projects that I've been involved with since the month of March that were motivated by the fight against COVID-19. And hopefully along the way, as I discuss these, maybe come with you to some perspective on the maybe the collective aspects that are involved, and opening maybe some questions for my next intervention on the 29th, looking forward into the future of AI for social good. So, well, I think for this crowd, I don't need to spend a lot of time to explain that because machine learning has gone out of labs and into society and is being deployed, it's really important that scientists and engineers who are involved in all this understand their new responsibility, that their work has impact, and they have to be mindful of that impact. And to go back to the collective aspect of things, that each of us, with our expertise, we may be very strong in our branch, but we are babies and blind people as it comes to so many other parts of human knowledge and understanding. And so we need to rely on others to understand, especially things like, what's going to be the impact of my work, or what could be the impact of my work on society. There are people who study these things professionally, and I'm just a machine learning scientist, but I'm not a sociologist, for example. And I'm not an ethicist, and I'm not an economist, and so on. And so you need to work with other people, and we'll see that in the examples that I'll talk about today. Before going there, let me also give you a little bit of my concern looking forward with respect to the development of technology and AI in particular. And I use a phrase that I find very nice to capture this idea that there's a wisdom race, a race between the progress of technology and our collective wisdom. So I think our collective wisdom is improving. Sometimes it looks like we're stepping backwards, but if you look over decades or centuries, it does look like we're becoming collectively wiser, that we're reducing pain in the world in many ways. However, the pace at which we're introducing new tools in the world is scary, because those tools can be used to in a way that could be detrimental to collective well-being. So in particular, powerful tools like AI can be used for bringing a lot of good, but they can also be used by those who are in power, or those who might grab power thanks to those tools. And those tools can thus be dangerous for the majority of us. And that is why it's so important to work with people who understand the social impact, to keep that in mind, and to not just think as a, say, scientist or as an engineer, but also as a citizen and a concerned one. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two projects today. I'm going to talk about a project that has to do with contact tracing, and I'm going to talk about a project that has to do with discovering new drugs for antivirals, as antivirals. So the first project, we call it COVI, and it's the work of a lot of people. You see the list of names here. There is an archive paper called COVI White Paper, where you can find a lot more detail about that. And I'll give you an outline of what we've been doing. So, very early on, as we were learning about the pandemics in February and March, well, we got to step out of I got to step out of my usual comfort zone, and having to read a lot about epidemiology. I learned about things like incubation periods, infectiousness, and the different states in which a person could be in the course of the disease, like a viral disease. So there are these four states that we really care about in the modeling the spread of the disease. So each person could be susceptible, meaning they have not yet been infected. Maybe they will never be, but they could. And then they get in the exposed state, where they have been infected, but it doesn't show yet. The virus is reproducing inside their body. Then they get to be infectious. So that is when there are enough viruses in your body that they can go out of your body and infect others. And then finally, normally, hopefully you recover, your body kills off those viruses, and you're in the last stage here. Sometimes it's death. So you can think of a kind of state machine where people can go through these, and we'd like to understand better how people go from one to the other. And one of the important quantities here that we show on the graph is called a viral load. So the viral load is the amount of a virus that you're sending out into the world. Of course, it's going to depend on other things effectively, like, if I'm wearing a mask, I'm going to send less virus outside of my body. But the amount that your body can produce is kind of characterized by this temporal curve, where you see a peak during the incubation. So even before you see symptoms for SARS-CoV-2, it turns out that you can become very infectious. So essentially, the height of that curve is how infectious you are to others. How, what's the chance that if you spend time with someone else, you will be infecting them. So what's interesting also to ponder about this figure is that the person normally gets to have clues about the fact that they're infectious only when they start having symptoms. And initially, the symptoms might not be obvious. I mean, you may have a runny nose or a cough, and it could be just a regular cold. Later, the symptoms become more obvious. But even before you have symptoms, you see this peak of a viral load, which means that a lot of infections are actually happening by people who don't have any clue that they're infected. And in fact, that's one of the big problems with this virus, right? That a lot of the people are infecting others without knowing. What happens is, as soon as you start having symptoms, if you're, if you've, by now everybody knows that this is an issue, in February or March or April, a lot of people didn't realize, but by now most people would change their behavior once they start having symptoms to try to take less risks, in the sense of risk to others. In other words, self-isolate, make sure to be more disciplined with masks and everything. So one of the interesting questions that this work is about is, can we help people know how infectious they are so they can act appropriately? Well, the most important part is, even before they have any information, that's like in the green part here, when they are asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic, but they are infecting others, but also even early on when they start having symptoms, or even before they have a test that they have symptoms but they're not sure, can we help them figure out how they should behave? Okay, so that's what we're trying to do here. And in order to do that, we built an epidemiological model, which we call an agent-based epidemiological model, in order to simulate different kinds of policies that agents could have in order to change their behavior based on the information they have. And also, these policies would control what kind of information they might exchange with others. So if I think that I might be infectious, not only can I change my behavior, but I can tell my contacts, the people I spend time with, or the people I spent time with, the people I encountered in the past, to tell them, hey, you know what, we met 3 days ago, and I now realize that I'm probably infected. So I could have been infectious 3 days ago, and you should be careful. Maybe you're infected too. Okay, so that kind of message can be sent between those agents. Now, the idea, of course, is to automate that process. People will do these kind of things spontaneously, but would like to make it easier and make sure we cover as many people as possible by using people's phones. So if my phone has access to information because I entered it about my symptoms, potentially my test results, and also keeps track of which other phone, which other people implicitly I was close to in the recent past, then it can do all these things. It can compute those probabilities that I'm infected, that I'm infectious, use these probabilities or these expected values to inform others and to inform my own behavior. So that's the gist of what we're trying to achieve. If we look at what information is available potentially on a phone in order to make those recommendations and send those messages to others, you have 4 kinds of information. You have the contacts that you had with other people and the messages that they might have sent to you about their own believed infectiousness. They think that they have a 50% chance of being infected or something. That's information you could get if they send you these messages. You have your symptoms that you have entered on the phone. Maybe it started with a runny nose and now you have this weird coughing, or even better, you've lost your sense of smell. And then you have test results. Maybe I did pass a test 1 week ago or yesterday. Those test results, potentially that information could come directly from public health, or it could be self-entered. That creates all kinds of potential problems. But for now, from a machine learning point of view, we can consider that we have this kind of information. And then we have sort of general background information about the person. We know age, for example, makes a big difference. We know that some medical conditions make you much more likely to become infected. So all of these informations can come into the prediction of infectiousness. So why do we predict infectiousness or contagiousness, the same thing? Well, there are two kinds of actions we want to take, as I said. There's changing my behavior and then changing your behavior if we've met before by sending you information that you could use to change your behavior. And as far as my behavior is concerned, the most important variable is how contagious am I now? If I'm very contagious, then I should really isolate myself. Maybe even go to quarantine. And that's one kind of prediction, is the current contagiousness. But for the messages I may send to the people I have met in the past, really what matters is the contagiousness that I think I had when I met them. So in the past, you're trying to do inference over past contagiousness, given the information that I have now. Like maybe now I have symptoms, and that means I probably was infectious 3 days ago. So these are the two kinds of things you want to predict, at least in our framework. Then there's the question of privacy. Like, so what kind of information should we allow to be communicated between people or between a person and some central server? So I won't have time to go in a lot of these things, but there's a huge amount of work that is going on around the world and went in our project in the question of the tension between privacy and the ability to make predictions. So, for example, those messages that I talked about, that kind of risk messages, how contagious do I think that I was 3 days ago that I may send to you? I don't want to send too many bits about that, because if I send you, for example, like a real value with 32 bits, then someone receiving that information may be able to, by some sort of triangulation, figure out who I am. So one of the things we want to avoid with privacy protection is for others to figure out that I'm sick, or that, or to know even worse, where I was and who I met. So these kinds of information people don't want to share, at least not with everyone or anyone they meet in the street. They might be willing to share some of these informations with governments, but again, they probably don't want to share like where they were. Currently, with manual contact tracing, you do share some of that information if you're sick, right? And so a lot of the current contact tracing methods only require the people who have been diagnosed positive to send to share a lot of information with government and employees that are doing contact tracing. Okay, in our case, the risk levels have been quantized to 4 bits, and the behavior information. So how do I convert my expected contagiousness, for example, into different behaviors? We have only considered 2 bits of information here. So that's like just 4 levels, from normal to quarantine at the other extreme. Okay. Again, from a machine learning perspective, what we're trying to do is predict that viral load, because that, if you're in a region where you have a high viral load, then you want to have a stronger isolation, for example. And we're going to use information about the recent past. So because we know that after 2 weeks, most of the time you should be through that temporal curve. We look at the last 2 weeks of data from on the phone about your past symptoms and the encounters information that has been connected about the encounters you've had, and so on, and test results, of course. Let me explain quickly a little bit about what this kind of information about symptoms can do compared to currently used manual tracing, and also binary tracing, which is what you find, for example, in the Apple Google protocol, and many systems that have been put out there use binary tracing. So we call it binary because the only information that is being communicated is this one bit that either you had a positive test or you met with somebody who was positive. So this one bit of information is the only kind of information that is being communicated, which is great from a privacy perspective, because it's harder to trace things if you only know one bit. But if somebody were to catch that information, but unfortunately, by doing that, first of all, to reduce the number of false positives and false negatives, you rely on a very strong clue, which is, okay, you got a result, it's positive, so then you share that information. Whereas if you're allowing yourself to share more, to record more information like symptoms, then you can provide a much earlier warning signal. So as soon as I start having symptoms like coughing, maybe I could share that information, not exactly that I'm coughing, but like what's the expected contagiousness of somebody who's coughing and is a male in their 60s, right? So that kind of information, not that I'm a male in my 60s, but rather the probability of infecting others or the expected contagiousness, that's the thing that I would like to share with others that I've met so that they can change their behavior. So what we see in this figure are 3 timelines of a character, Jim. On Wednesday, Jim has a risky contact with a stranger. And then later, the stranger actually is starting to have symptoms. Under manual tracing or digital binary tracing, as is currently done, that information about the stranger's symptoms doesn't get to me. It's only much later when the stranger gets a test that it might come to me. And with manual tracing, it might come to me even later than the test itself because of the human factor in the loop. It's often at least a day, and then sometimes when the manual tracing is overwhelmed, it might be several days before the information gets back to you. Somebody calls you, and so we're all of that time that information is not propagating is crucial time that you could have warned somebody who was maybe not yet symptomatic and is infecting others. So in the timeline in the bottom, this is the Covey app that we designed. In fact, as soon as the stranger shows symptoms, my phone would receive some kind of message with very few bits of information, but enough to tell me that I should be more careful. And I could change my behavior recommendation to a slightly higher level. And then later, when the stranger's symptoms grow worse and it's more clear, the probability that they're infected, then again, that information would come to me, and I might decide to say, not go to a restaurant or not go to a place where I would have otherwise met people and potentially infected them. So that's the idea of early awareness and how it can save lives, because the people who might not yet know that they are infected can get early warning or early clues because of the other people they've met who have stronger information because they're more downstream of the disease stage to help me assess and become more aware of my own infection status, and thus change my behavior and avoid infecting others. Okay, I'm not gonna. I'm just gonna show some results of simulations we've made So in order to evaluate different strategies, contact tracing methods, what we've done is we've built this epidemiological simulator where you can play with the policy that each person executes. So that policy, as I said, changes their behavior and changes the messages that they send to others. And so in here, we're comparing the three strategies. So the orange one on top is you don't do anything, no tracing at all. And on the, let me explain the axis here. The x-axis is the number of contacts you're allowing yourself to have per day, per person. And then on the y-axis is the R, this is the rate of the spread of the virus. So when R is greater than 1, the virus, the number of people infected increases exponentially. When R is less than 1, it decreases exponentially. And of course, the larger it is above 1, the exponent is larger, and vice versa when it's less than 1 and closer to 0. So we want R to be small, and we want it to be less than 1. At least we want to push it down, because you have to understand that these techniques are far from perfect, because they rely on noisy information. So so this is going to be one tool in the arsenal against the virus. Okay, so what are we seeing now? We'd like those curves to be low, basically, right? It says, and what those curves show also is a trade-off, right? So if I spend more time with other people, which is the x-axis, because I'm constraining myself less, then that's, and if everybody behaves in average according to this is the number of contacts in average per day per human, then the virus will spread more, in fact, exponentially more when you're above 1. And so you have this trade-off. If I were to restrain my freedom totally, I don't see anyone, then R would be 0. And in practice, of course, we can't achieve that. And so what we want is the curve to be lower, but yeah, it's important to understand that trade-off. In principle, we can choose to be anywhere we want. So societies right now take collective decisions. Different governments make different choices where we might choose to be more or less on the left or more or less on the right, where we are willing to tolerate more people getting infected because in exchange for having more freedom. Because maybe that freedom is important, for example, for people to survive because they need to work to feed themselves. So these are not obvious trade-offs, but it's interesting to show results in terms of that trade-off. It's a sort of Pareto curve, if you want. Okay, so what we see in the results in the orange is, as I said, no tracing. In purple is the binary tracing, so things like the AIforGood method, and you can see already that it's really helping, right? It's helping to reduce the R substantially, and the curves are the fit of these different simulations. And then the gray line is one using our methods, using self-reported symptoms. Okay, I'm going to move on to the other project about discovering drugs to fight COVID-19. So we've been looking at two approaches, one sort of shorter term and one longer term. The shorter term approach to find drugs is to take existing drugs, and actually you can try to find a single drug that already exists, and people have already done that. And yeah, we haven't found a single drug that really kills that virus. But there's a lot of current effort trying to find pairs or potentially triples of drugs. So think about the HIV virus, which at the end, we fight with 3 drugs. And the other option is to look over a much larger space, the space of all the possible drug-like molecules. It's a huge space. So the advantage of taking existing drugs over creating new drugs is that we can do that exploration faster in the case of existing drugs because we know their toxicity. We know what the side effects are. They've been tested. Of course, their combination could potentially make a difference, but for the most part, we take less risk with existing drugs. When you create a new drug, it might take a while before you realize that there is some side effect that you haven't seen. So that's why it's good to do the two strategies, and this is what's happening around the world. Regarding the machine learning techniques, interestingly, for both approaches, you can use graph neural nets. So graph neural nets could be used to essentially extend the realm of applicability of neural nets from fixed size vectors to any kind of graph-like data structure. And so here, there are two kinds of graphs that we care about. There is the graph corresponding to the molecular structure. So think of each node being one atom, but it could be a set of atoms that form a rigid part, for example. Or think about the graph formed by all of the molecules, all of the drugs that we currently know, like a few thousand drugs, as well as all of the proteins that we know are associated with those drugs, because often a drug is a molecule that's going to attach, it's going to bind to a particular protein, and it's going to prevent the protein from doing its job typically, or it's going to change the way the protein does its job. Proteins are like the building blocks of our body. So drugs are interfering with the normal operation of these proteins. And there's a lot of knowledge that already exists about the relationship between those drugs and proteins, and also how different proteins are related to each other. And as we collect data about pairs of drugs that are tested in assays, then that gives us more information to put in this graph. So it's a huge graph, right? It has tens of thousands of nodes and different kinds of nodes, the drugs, the proteins. And what we're trying to do is make predictions about some of these edges. Like, so between two nodes, there is an edge, and we want to know if there's a synergy in using that pair of drugs to attack the virus. Okay, another machine learning technology that is really useful in these projects is reinforcement learning and active learning. So the way we can use reinforcement learning here is to generate new drugs by going through a sequence of changes in the current candidate molecule by adding pieces, removing pieces. And then the reward we get is that the drug we're proposing binds with high affinity to the target protein we care about. The active learning part is actually interesting for both projects. And it comes in the form of exploration that is needed here. So what we're really trying to do here is create an interaction between the machine learning that's proposing candidate drugs and the biology, the chemical and biological assays that are used to evaluate those drugs. So let's say that we propose 50 candidates, or actually 100 candidates, and that could go actually 96 candidates. This is that we have these 96 wells assays, so we can try 96 things at a time, and we're gonna get answers for these 96 candidates, how good they are at doing the job. So that information becomes additional training data that could be used to improve the machine learning part. And then the machine learning is going to propose new candidates. Okay, so as you iterate through this, you want to be not just trying to go for the best guess, but something that will bring you information. So you want a kind of exploration. So where there is a drug where you're not sure that it really works, but there's a high potential that it could work. In other words, there's a lot of uncertainty, then you might want to try that drug. Whereas if you have a drug that you're pretty sure because you tested it in the past, or because you had something very similar tested in the past, you're pretty sure that it's good, but it's not good enough, and there's not much uncertainty around its value, so it's probably not worth it. So even though the second drug that I mentioned looks like it has a better expected activity, the first one, because of the uncertainty aspect, is the one that we want to test in the assay. And so that's what active learning is about, to go for knowledge and trying to iteratively propose examples to be labeled, if you want, in order to acquire information so that downstream you will end up with a better solution. Okay. I'm not going to go through all these other slides. Molecules, and this is interesting because it shows how these very small molecules in red are, in 3D space, really going to bind, to attach themselves in some particular location in the protein, which is the blue spaghetti. What you want to predict is both the binding affinity, but also whether the drug is synthesizable, and also whether it's toxic. So you train different neural nets for each of these things, and then we can check how good those predictions are, which is what those graphs are showing. And then you have this active learning pipeline. I mean, and in many ways you can do active learning, but the general idea is sort of filtering, right? So initially your guesses are not very good. You try some molecules, you get information by doing those assays. That information allows you to retrain, and now you can focus more on the more interesting candidates, and then you're gonna ask to label those candidates. And now you collect more data and so on. So you have this sort of filtering from an initially huge number of potential molecules, like the zinc data set that we use that has 200 million molecules, down to a few candidates. And once you have found candidates that are really good according to those biological assays, then you can go to even clinical trials. Again, there are a lot of people involved in this project, and I'm not going to name them, but I am really thankful for everyone's contribution. Oh, and now is a good time to mention the collaborations, because as I said at the very beginning, many of these AI for social good projects, they involve collaboration with people who have different expertise. So in the previous project with contact tracing, we collaborated with people with expertise in privacy, people with expertise in sociology, in politics as well, because there are political decisions involved. In the project with the molecules, we're collaborating with people who have expertise in chemistry and biology and medicine. So you really need to work with experts outside your field in order to make these kinds of applied projects successful. Okay, I only have 2 slides left, and I want to go back to sort of the collective aspects of things. One thing that is particular about AI as a technology to solve problems is that it needs data, right? At least the current brand of AI that uses machine learning. And in both projects, one of the biggest obstacles is getting that data in the first place. In the contact tracing, the problem is, one is sort of privacy issues, and the other is political issues. If people are not sufficiently convinced that, reassured that they don't trust, this weird technology, they're not going to use it. And if they don't use it, it's not going to work. And there's a quadratic effect here that's interesting to mention. So let's say that let's say that there's only 10% of the population which adopts a particular contact tracing technology, whether it's the kind of thing we did or others that exist out there, that means that 10% times 10%, that is 1% of the contacts. So the contacts are two people meet each other, right? So if of all the contacts, if you think that randomly some subset is going to be visible to the system so that it can do its computations, if a fraction p of the population adopts the app, then a fraction p squared of the contacts are being used to make those predictions or those decisions. So with 1% of the contacts, it's not going to work, right? There's just not enough information being communicated between those agents. And so the trust and the political aspect here become really important. Let me close by saying a few words about the data aspects regarding drug discovery. So here you need data coming from these assays, and these assays are very expensive. Unfortunately, I mean, those assays are also very worthwhile to drug companies. The problem is the current economic system we have for drug discovery with pharma companies, doesn't give them any incentive to share their data. Instead, they tend to keep it secret. And well, that's one issue that comes from the profit maximization as an objective. Whereas if we were to do drug discovery where the objective was to maximize public health, then we would share data. So one of the things I want to talk about in my next presentation on 29th is, is there any way that we can change the incentive system so that the entities involved in data collection would share their data. And in fact, this is a more general problem, right? Drug discovery is a form of knowledge acquisition where really we're not building anything. Like the cost of actually producing the drugs is tiny compared to the cost of acquiring the knowledge to find out the good molecules. And knowledge is not a usual market, it's not a usual product, because there's a fixed cost for obtaining it, discovery, and then essentially zero cost for sharing the information. It's like software, right? So there's a sort of market distortion, market problem where that makes the profit maximization not well aligned with the common good. And then one of the questions I'm asking is, can we imagine other economic models or rules of the game or incentives that would make those endeavors better aligned with the common good? Thank you. I guess that was this slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I think that the concept of incentives is a central one. And you mentioned that. I would like to go back to, I think we have some questions. We're going to answer some questions from the audience as well. But one specific question I would like to start with, you talked about the obstacles of data sharing, specifically for the drug discovery ecosystem. But do you envision an alternative economic model for drug discovery that will facilitate data and knowledge sharing?
Yes. In a nutshell, we already have a solution, and it's called academia. No, and I don't mean that we necessarily do the same thing, but let me explain. So think of university labs as if they were like small companies, right? What are they trying to optimize? They're trying to provide something useful for society, which is what work and it should be rewarded in some that should be rewarded, but they're not getting money there directly. I mean, it's a different funding model than if you are in a company where it's a sales directly. You're getting funded by governments, and governments or philanthropy is going to try to measure whether what we do is useful to society according to some metrics that are different from profit. And as a part of that, I mean, one of the metric is we want to encourage knowledge producers like academic labs to share the knowledge. In fact, if they don't publish anything, and then they don't get any points next time, right? So yeah, and the model I have in mind is not exactly the same, but that's where I'm getting my inspiration.
Well, that's definitely a great direction. Let me try to bring some questions that we received from the audience. One of them is related to your previous examples on contact tracing. And the question is that we assume we have all more than 8 contacts a day. Did you run simulations in this scenario with 8 contacts a day?
Yeah. We run simulations with dozens of contacts a day. So it's interesting to have a simulator exactly for being able to do these kinds of things. So with simulators, you can control all kinds of knobs and see what happens. You can see what would happen if people go in lockdown, for example, and then you have different degrees of lockdown. Like you never go to zero. It's you at least going to be close to your family and your household. You can play with strategies. Governments may say, okay, we're going to close the schools, or we're going to force people to wear a mask outside or something. And how does that affect the outcomes? Now, what's complicated with simulators is, well, where do you get the knowledge about what are the effects of different strategies? And the good news is, over the last few months, there's been thousands of studies on the medical side, on sort of the strategy side, that help us get a sense of what these quantities are. For example, we now know a lot about the viral curve. We didn't know that much in March, for example. So we're trying to use the simulator itself is based on hundreds of papers that have been published on the disease and on different strategies that people have been using.
Similar to still on the topic of contact tracing, a question was related to the differences between Western countries and Asia, where in Asia contact tracing have been more successful. Do you have insight or knowledge, either for academic exchanges with other colleagues or by different methods, on why this is? Is it basically because of relaxation on privacy rules, or maybe there is a data trust model that works better? For other reasons?
So I'm not an epidemiologist, and I'm not an expert in the West versus East thing. But yeah, obviously I've seen this and I've read about it. My personal non-expert opinion is that a big factor has been that many of these societies were already used to wearing those masks, right? And also in general being more disciplined. If governments say don't do this, then you don't do it, and also be more willing to accept punishment if you don't do it. Whereas I guess in the West we value freedom a lot more, which could be hurting us in this particular case. So this is a very interesting question about the balance between different values, right? So privacy, freedom, life and death or health, okay, all of these things we may give a different weight, and different people, of course, and different countries, different cultures will give a different weight, and then the outcomes are different. And it's not obvious that our culture, which we think is better, is taking the right decisions.
Well, that's definitely something that we're all trying to have a better understanding of. There are 2 interesting questions. I think we have time for these 2 as well. One of them is about, I'm going to read the question for you. With increasing commercialization of academic projects, are the incentives still aligned with social purposes? And the following of that question says, it seems many of the problematic developments in AI start in academia based on who funds the research. So
okay, let me start with the first thing, and they're connected. So I think that we've made huge progress, both economic and social, in society with the economic model that we currently have. But it is also a model that is leading us in a very bad direction right now if we continue on this trajectory. It's leading to concentration of power, concentration of wealth, and in fact, it's dangerous for democracy because concentration of power is exactly the opposite of what democracy should be about. Right? Democracy is sharing of power. So I feel like the profit maximization incentive has something fundamentally flawed that we need to fix. Now, how to fix this? Obviously, this is an open question, and my little discussion at the end is trying to stimulate discussion about that. Of course, economists have been thinking about, and political scientists have been thinking about these questions for a long time. But coming from the perspective of the application of AI in the world, I think is interesting to maybe suggest some directions. I've seen, for example, academics who are polluted by the profit maximization objective. So in particular, in the drug discovery arena, but in other areas, if you're doing research in a university, say you're a PhD student, and you think you've stumbled onto something very useful that potentially could be commercialized, you might want to keep it secret for a while at least, right? And maybe forever, even though you shouldn't, because in academia, our objective function, the way we are going to be rewarded has to do with sharing of knowledge and the quality of that knowledge and so on. And so I think that this profit maximization objective is influencing academics in a bad way. And so what I'm proposing is to influence the business world, or at least the way that the outside academia is working, with some of the incentive mechanisms that we have found to work within academia. And I think that would help with the second question as well, because a lot of the bad uses of AI are due to people in companies focusing foremost on maximizing their profit, the profit for their company, their career, by opposition to what's going to be the social impact, what's going to be the environmental impact, what's going to be the health impact. And so I think when we start thinking about AI for good, we really need to think about how do we change the political economic systems that we have around the world to make these powerful technologies work for the common good, work for those who need it the most, rather than those who have the most power.
I think this is a topic that you're going to be covering on September 29th for the next phase of AI for Good, but I invite everyone to join on the 29th for that. As you discussed the academic model, and Dario Gil will join us soon to talk also about science, maybe a model of open science could be adopted by a synergy between public and private and business and research, where in fact sharing more knowledge could be actually a booster, an energizer for all objective functions, not just profit.
That's
but
right.
that open science model has to be probably laid out in a way that increase agreement between everyone.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be part of the incentives, that transparency, which is a good way to reduce corruption, and transparency and knowledge sharing, which are part of the objective function, that they are, you have no choice if you want to be a good citizen of this new system I'm thinking about, that you share a lot of information. And in activities, human activities that involve knowledge, like data and AI, and a lot of science in general, I think it's very important, because right now what happens is that different entities reinvent the wheel because there's so much knowledge that is being kept secret, so much data that is not being shared. And so if you think about my drug discovery example, let's say there's about 10 big pharma company right now. And that means we are paying 10 times the price for acquiring that knowledge because they're duplicating a lot of the effort.
Well, I think that the topic is not only super important, but complex, and the discussions have to be continued. And those examples that you cited and all this effort, I think, are the beginning of the collaboration that we have to somehow find a way to put in motion. I think we have more questions, but we are running out of time. I think we can continue the conversation on Slack. I invite everyone to join the Slack channel. I'm going to put it on the chats soon to continue your questions, and we will answer them. Yes, the Slack channel is there. Yasha, it's always a pleasure to have you, and it's always inspiring and very positively, I think, energizing in terms of thinking about what we do is just more than one goal. We have a layer of goals that we have to reach, and academic purpose is one, learning and knowledge sharing is another one, but also thinking about the common good is not easy. And we need to create sustainability in our approaches. So thank you again for joining us. And we're going to have Dario Gil joining us right after you to talk about the opportunity for science as well. So there is going to be an interesting complementary approach. Thank you again, Joshua.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for your questions, and it's interesting to discuss, but we cannot have all the time. It's my pleasure now to welcome Dario Gil, who's the director of Ibm Research, which is one of the world's largest and most influential corporate research lab in the world. I'd like to introduce him with his bio. As you know, Ibm Research is a global organization with, I think, more than 3,000 researchers in 6 continents, and they're working in advancing computing. And Dr. Gil actually leads innovation effort at IBM, directing not only research strategists in quantum, AI, hybrid cloud, security, industrial solutions, and also semiconductor systems. And he's the 12th director in his 74-year history of IBM Research. So prior to current appointment, Dr. Gil served as Chief Operating Officer of IBM Research and VP of AI and Quantum Computing, areas in which he continues to have broad responsibilities across IBM. And under his leadership, IBM was the first company in the world to build programmable quantum computers and make them universally available through the cloud as the first one. So Dr. Gil is head of collaborative research models, which we're going to be talking today. And he's also the co-chair of the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab, a pioneering industrial academic lab with a portfolio of more than 50 projects focused on advancing fundamental AI research to benefit industry and society. So Dr. Gil, welcome to AIforGood Global Summit Breakthrough Days. We're happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. It's hopefully you can hear me okay, and it's such a wonderful pleasure to be with all of you today to talk about the urgency of science and the relationship between the revolution of computing that we're witnessing right now to the opportunities that science is going to afford us. So let me begin sharing. Hopefully you can see this okay. Let me make it big. Okay. So, as a first introduction, let me tell you where I'm presenting to you. This is the global headquarters of IBM Research. It's about 45 minutes north of New York City. And it's this beautiful building that was designed by Eero Saarinen, opened in 1961. So this is from where I'm broadcasting today. And, the reality of it is that the reason we're so passionate about the role of science and the role of research in the world is that we obviously have not run out of problems to solve in our world, and that we're being challenged with ever more complex problems to deal with. Even though, this small virus of no more than 100 nanometers, is wreaking havoc in the world, the path for us to get out of the current situation is going to be through the means that we can accelerate the rate of scientific discovery, right? To find new treatments and new cures. And when we look at this issue, we have to recognize and scale the need and the urgency across society that science provides the critical knowledge for decision making. So when, even in the context of a pandemic, the way we respond to it and the policies that we put forth must be grounded and driven by scientific thinking and the scientific methodology. That is also the path for treatment in terms of developing proven therapies and ultimately vaccines. But even in this context, science must transcend this moment. And we're going to be talking about the implications of the role of accelerated discovery, let's say in the world of materials, which I'll give as an example, for the future of agriculture and next generation of fertilizers to grow, to feed a growing population while using significantly less energy intensive production mechanisms for fertilizers, or the future of transportation and what it's going to mean also in electrification and the role of materials in that space, as well as energy and in the future of global health. So first point is, this urgency of science in the current moment. The second one is the fact that it needs to transcend this current moment. So it's worth a reflection as to what is actually happening in this moment around how we conduct scientific discovery. And, and this can be a source of debate on its own right, but, just for illustration purposes, if we look at the evolution of the scientific discovery process from empirical science to the introduction of a much more theoretically grounded approach to understand our world, with the advent of computers, right? The introduction of computational science and the role of simulations as an example to be able to guide discovery. And of course, over the last number of decades, driven by the increasing quality of our scientific instruments, the preponderance of big data, and how that has helped us also to enhance our quality of observations and detecting patterns and anomalies, and the role of visualization to understand our environment. But we're entering a new and unique opportunity right now, which is this era of accelerated discovery. And AI, given the topic of this conference, is going to play an absolutely central role on how we amplify the scientific method of studying, hypothesizing, testing, assessing the results of our experiments, reporting. In the previous conversation, we were talking about the importance of sharing this knowledge, and to be able to then trigger questioning and proceed through this loop. And if you look around it and the opportunities for AI to facilitate this process, enhance this process by the way we integrate knowledge, of being able to use the latest advantage of natural language processing and knowledge representations as a means to tap onto all the previous publications in our scientific literature and our own internal reports that we may have in our respective institutions. The role of hypothesis generation, right? And the use of generative models. And I'll give some examples of how that's being applied to the world of chemistry today. The role of when we conduct experimentation and virtual experimentation through AI-enriched simulations to be able to guide and to do less of a brute force approach to simulation, like we may historically have done with high-performance computing in some cases. The role of AI to drive autonomous testing through new form of robotic laboratories, let's say to do chemical synthesis that can be guided by AI, as well as, of course, the continuous discovery flow. So, this is just to touch on the richness and the opportunity that our community in the world of AI can have to influence the approach in which we conduct scientific discovery outright. So just to touch as just one example of this is, of course, the application of contemporary AI techniques to the world of language is well known. And it is not a leap to then imagine what are all the possible languages that we can apply AI to. And chemistry, of course, is an example of a language, right? And it has its own specific symbols, its own approach on how you're able to combine molecules to be able to produce a reaction and produce an output. And by applying, in this case, generative models as an approach to be able to predict reactions and essentially to do chemistry in a new way, it's been really a fascinating field of what has happened in the last number of years and how much progress around that. So let me see if I can play a short video to illustrate a body of work that we have been conducting that is illustrative of what's going on in the field around concatenating all of these capabilities to drive an autonomous chemistry lab. So let me see if I can play this.
It takes approximately 10 years and $10 million from the design concept to the market for a single material. And this is a time that we cannot afford, especially in situations where we have threatening diseases that are affecting the entire humanity. RoboXN is a pioneering project that shows how the combination of the three technologies, cloud, AI, and automation, can dramatically change the way we work. Imagine a chemist at home willing to make a molecule connecting to RoboXN through a web browser, drawing the molecule, and having RoboXN recommending the optimal synthetic route together with the starting commercial material. And finally, RoboXN self-programming itself to execute the process in an autonomous laboratory. So with the RoboXN technology, we are expecting to accelerate profoundly the way we do material discovery. It's revolutionizing an entire field, bringing chemistry from a traditional type of business into an high-tech business.
So I think what is very interesting around this new approach of doing AI for chemistry in this example, where you're partnering with the expertise of, of a chemist, in this example, as a scientist, as a means to be able to accelerate discovery with the use of this type of generative models, but then also to connect it. I mean, in this case, it's been the demonstration of like the sequence of steps that are necessary to synthesize the material, and then connected it to a robotic environment to be able to execute that. And we just released actually today a vision of, for example, 5 key materials innovations that will have a profound impact in the world and kind of have a profound impact in our world in the next 5 years through this process of accelerated discovery. And just to give some examples around this, means to be able to generate novel membranes to do carbon separation at the point of emission is an example of a materials innovation that can be crucially important. The ability to improve the current fertilizers that we have right now. I mean, if you look at the Harvard-Bosch process to be able to convert nitrogen into the soil that we use today, it consumes about 2 to 3% of energy production in the world today. And we know nature does this much more efficiently. Plants do so. So the ability to be able to replicate nature's ability to do that nitrogen fixation would be, will have a lot of implications for the world of food production and energy. Battery technology, right? Today we rely on lithium-ion batteries technologies, but obviously the use of nickel and cadmium, as an example on that, are non-sustainable materials that have a lot of also supply chain implications and ethical considerations around that. And there are new chemistries that are going to be possible with similar energy or improved energy density and safety around this. We're looking also on the world of electronic materials that we use to manufacture semiconductors that also have to be made sustainable. So we've explored here the use of novel generation of photoresist that used for the fabrication process of chips. And finally, new small molecules that can neutralize viruses, and how we will accelerate the pace at which we can create these molecules and get them to bind, in this case, to the spiking protein of the coronavirus. So all examples of what an impact it can have to be able to accelerate that. And if any of you want to give this a try, how do you do chemistry assisted by AI? I encourage you to take a look at the RoboRxN environment. And there's been, over 1 billion chemical reactions that have already been done with the use of some of these techniques. So let me touch on a complementary technology now. I was mentioning before that we're witnessing a revolution of computing. And I like to say that the moment of the future of computing that we're witnessing is a convergence of bits, neurons, and qubits. And that it's not about one replacing the other, but like that classical high precision architectures to implement mathematical operations, the world of bits that Claude Shannon gave us, the neural and neural-based technologies that are the heart of modern day AI, and the implications that has for the world of inference and classification, and also, as we just talked of, generative models and things of the sort. And finally, the world of qubits, right? The intersection of the world of information and physics and the opportunity to rethink at a very fundamental level, what is the nature of information and how should we process it? So I wanted to just give a flavor that maybe is complementary to this conference on the world of qubits and why that's going to matter also for accelerating discovery in the world of science. And at the root of it is that if you look at the problem of modeling nature, right, performing chemistry or doing physics, the reality of it is that that is an exponential problem, in the sense that if you want to model the chemical interactions, let's say of electrons of two elements as they combine together and the interactions, the number of calculations you have to perform is exponential, roughly speaking, with the number of electrons present in the calculation. So by the time you have 50 or 75 or 100 electrons that you gotta go and perform the calculation, you're dealing with an exponential problem that classical machines cannot do well. Now, this is a problem that goes back to the very origins of the idea of quantum computers. And in 1981, Richard Feynman, in a conference that actually, interestingly enough, was jointly organized between IBM Research and MIT, called The Physics of Computation. He had this great lecture, and he gave this quote that he says, "Nature isn't classical, damn it. And if you want to make a simulation of nature, you'd better make it quantum mechanical. And by golly, it's a wonderful problem because it doesn't look so easy." So basically what he was saying is that, look, if you want to be able to simulate nature, you need to build an instrument that behaves like nature, that behaves quantum mechanically. And that is at the root of what quantum computers are about. And what is very fascinating is, while the theory is something that has been built over a number of decades, it is just recently, over the last number of years, that the first experimental and first demonstrations of small-scale quantum computers have become possible. There are different ways to implement quantum computers. You can use ions, and in our case, we use superconducting devices and materials, specifically in IBM, something known as a transmon qubit. But essentially, you're creating a very controlled artificial atom that has well-defined states, and that you can control exquisitely by injecting energy into the system. In our case, these superconducting qubits are inside a cryostat, and they operate at about 15 millikelvin. So, pretty close to absolute zero. And at the bottom here, you see that shiny object. That's where the qubits live. That's the quantum processor itself. And these coaxial cables that you see here are superconducting coaxial cables that allow us to transmit microwave pulses at the 5 gigahertz regime or so, to be able to then exquisitely control the interaction of the qubits, whether they're in the ground state or in the excited state, and how do we couple qubits to one another. So the way this is going to be used in the future, and even today, what I demonstrated is, you're going to use your favorite computer program, and there will be essentially call functions that will call quantum circuits on the cloud, and we will match those quantum circuits to specific quantum computers that will return then the answer to the programmer, to the developer in your environment. In this case, I'm showing a chemistry calculation and the way that we conduct them. So our view is that the developer community and the software community is not going to have to learn a new language to program quantum computers, but rather that you would embed these call functions on something called quantum circuits against these cloud backends that will return calculations that are either extremely difficult to do with classical machines, or sometimes impossible to be able to achieve. And just to show you that this future is becoming a reality, this is an example of a new quantum community that has emerged over the last 4 years since we brought the first quantum computer on the cloud. And what you're seeing here is the users all over the world writing quantum circuits and executing them against actual quantum computers that we have designed and built. At present, we have built over 22 quantum computers that we have deployed on the IBM cloud. And now there's a community of over 250,000 users all over the world that have learned how to write a quantum circuit and run it against it. And over 360 billion quantum circuits have been run against these actual quantum processors, these backends. And this is just a view of this community, but from an institutional lens and how it's been growing. Now there's over 110 different institutions, many of them in academia and national laboratories, but also in the private sector, that are beginning to explore the implications of this new approach to process information to the world of science, the world of research, the world of education, and also the world of software applications. And just to give you a taste of what may happen in these coming years and this coming decade, This is, I like this picture because it's a testament of what can happen in 10 years. So in 2010, what you're seeing on the left-hand side, that's an example of a single qubit device to measure coherence of one of our superconducting devices that was done here in IBM Research. And come 10 years later, that's a picture of a 65 qubit processor right now with an incredible amount of technology in terms of novel approaches to qubits, to connectivity, to packaging, and so on. So a decade can be transformative in the world of technology. And if you look at then the next 10 years, a couple of weeks ago, we laid out a roadmap for the first time for this emerging industry. And we announced that today the largest device from a qubit perspective that we've deployed is a 65 qubit machine. And we said that next year we will have a 127 qubit machine. In 2022, a 433. And by 2023, we will build a machine with over 1,000 qubits. And most importantly, with about 100x lower error rate than is present today. And we believe that that will be a point of a significant inflection point in the industry, which will then prove the ability to build machines that can have hundreds of thousands and even millions of qubits. And when that can occur, the number of logical qubits that you can implement goes up, and therefore you will be able to build machines that can compute indefinitely while suppressing the errors. And when that occurs, it's going to be a game changer in terms of a number of applications that are going to matter. Just to show you a couple of visuals, as part of the execution of that roadmap, we're building, a giant cryostat. So this cryostat that you see here is designed to house up to 1 million qubits, and it's 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide. It weighs 8,000 pounds, and it's going to take 14 days to cool down to near absolute zero. And this is a wonderful picture of Jay Gambetta, who's an IBM fellow and leads the IBM Quantum program in the team. With a picture of him as Han Solo, essentially, right? But in the world of quantum. So I want to conclude with a reflection that as impressive as those technologies are, right? The world of AI combined with classical computing and the world of quantum to accelerate the rate of scientific discovery. There's a complementary dimension that goes beyond technology to address the urgency of science in our society. And that is the fact that in addition to technology, we need communities of discovery. I want to give you an example of institutional innovation in this space that may trigger then the basis for a good discussion. When we think about this idea of communities and communities of discovery, as we deal with more complex problems and the scale of the problems we're trying to tackle increases, it is self-evident that we have to go beyond what we can achieve just as individuals or as individual scientists and researchers in our case, to the role of institutions. It could be, an academic department, it could be a university, it could be a research lab like IBM Research. Of course, we all appreciate the importance then of partnership, right? Working collaboratively sometimes around the defined goal. But the importance that I think in this environment, in a place like this, it goes without saying, of the power of community, where we're combining common interest and purpose with also a methodology and approach to be able to share outcomes and to scale through the knowledge, as Joshua was talking about, being able to share knowledge in a different way. And as an example of how we should innovate in the world of creating new communities of discovery, I want to give you one example of something I've been very involved in, which is the creation of the COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of this story because I think it's illustrative of new ways of collaborating. But essentially now it's become the largest computing consortia that has ever been created. And and I'm just scrolling here, and I'll show you in a minute an example. A huge body of work that has been enabled by a new approach to collaboration. And I encourage all of you to take a look at the website of COVID-19HPCconsortium.org as an example. Let me tell you the origins of it and how it came about and why it's relevant to our broader conversation. At the beginning of the year, when the first sequencing of the SARS-CoV-2 virus was done in China, it led to a whole group of computer scientists and practitioners and computational biologists to begin exploring what was the role of high performance computing in to be able to accelerate our understanding of the virus. And in February of this year, researchers at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the University of Tennessee used IBM Summit, which was at the time the largest supercomputer in the world, to do a very interesting piece of work where they took 8,000 compounds, in this case small molecules, that could bind to the viral S protein, right? That is in the virus, and their goal was to be able to winnow down that large portfolio of potential small molecules to a much smaller set to be able to guide experimental efforts. And they published this really nice piece of work where they identified 77 small molecules and they ranked them on their propensity to bind to the spike protein, right? So when we look at that work and what was possible around that, we asked a question in March of how could we accelerate progress and scale the impact, right? If that was possible to be done, how could we aggregate enough supercomputing capacity and match it to the best scientists all over the world and prioritize it so that could happen? And that's what led to the creation of the High Performance Computing Consortium. So in the beginning of March, if you just look at the timeline, when we started thinking about this, we reached out here from Ibm Research to some of our colleagues at the national laboratories, exploring whether this idea of aggregating supercomputing capacity and create a new program would be of interest. They said at the time, a number of them said, well, that seems pretty promising. That would be exciting. So I made a phone call to Michael Kratsios, who's the Chief Technology Officer of the United States in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, and discussed the idea with him. And then we embarked in a collaborative effort to enlist different national laboratories, NASA, the National Science Foundation, other technology companies, including Microsoft and Google and Amazon and HP and many others, as well as different universities. And 5 days later, after that first discussion on March 17th, we launched a consortium. And since then, now it has grown so that we have over 85 research projects that are being executed concurrently. And we've aggregated now 600 petaflops of computing power. So these are all the partners that have come together, right, for a common purpose, in this case, and you can just see across industry and national labs, academia, and now also internationally, right? The UK and Switzerland and Sweden and Japan and so many others have joined this effort. And if I may say so, all of this was done without a single contract, right? So all out of like a desire to be able to pool resources and do things together. And in terms of like what has been enabled, you can see the growth of projects. The only ask that we make of all the scientists is that they got to publish their work and make it available, in exchange for the computing capacity that we're providing them. And we've been seeing a wonderful portfolio that I'm illustrating here, and I recommend all of you to take a look later when you get a chance, across basic science to be able to understand viral structure and function and viral human interaction and viral evolution, to therapeutics like target discovery and small molecule design and drug repurposing efforts. There's beautiful projects going on in that space, as well as patient trajectories, including doing very detailed modeling of how the virus can propagate through air and confined environments and what that means, etc. So wonderful, body of work and portfolio. So I'll conclude with a final reflection before we open for questions, now in the context of this institutional innovation and creativity. In thinking about this specific example of the High Performance Computing Consortium, it led to a reflection that one of the institutions and bodies that we're missing in our community is the need to create a scientific readiness reserve or a scientific reserve. And think about, by analogy for a minute, of a different institution that also has to cope at specific times with emergencies where we need to aggregate talent and capacity and skills to respond to emergencies. And think about something like the national reserves, right? Where you would have expertise, in this case, it could be engineers, right? Or scientists or doctors, right? Who are in civilian life. But during moments of need, that reserve can be called upon. And there are training exercises, there's support and funding mechanisms for them. And when they call upon, they can be deployed to meet the needs of an emergency. So why couldn't we have that for our community, for the scientific community? And as I, showcase that in a second, it got me thinking too about when we've had moments of crisis in the past. Let's look at beyond a crisis like an environment like World War II and at the end of World War II. What happened then, in the context, at least in the United States, was a very influential analysis and work that was done by Vannevar Bush. And I'm sure many of you may have heard about it, called Science, the Endless Frontier. And in 1945, he submitted this analysis and report to Eisenhower, where what he explored is we have mobilized the capacity of the nation, in this case, in the context of a war. But we need to now mobilize the scientific capacity of the nation in the context of peace and in the context of the future. And that led to a piece of institutional creativity, like the creation of the National Science Foundation, as an example in the United States, as a means to support basic scientific research. So it has led me through the course of this year, working with colleagues and collaborators in different contexts, to broadly explore this question about what is the nature now of scientific collaboration and the possibilities to create communities of discovery? And this proposal that we should create a scientific reserve or a scientific readiness reserves where all of us in our respective institutions can choose to serve in a volunteer fashion, but also we have a mechanism to coordinate and act when the time is needed. And today we do it ad hoc the best we can, but I think some planning would help us. And also more broadly on the need to elevate science and scientific thinking into the halls of power, just like we have legal and economic thinking in the halls of power, and that it is time to scale that scientific method more broadly to deal with the challenges that we confront in society. So I've included here a number of links of essays and podcasts that I've had on a variety of environments and The Economist and many other places. To be able to guide this discussion, I would love to get your feedback and of course your participation. So I'll close with a call to action. Just earlier this week as well, we launched a new digital environment, a new site on something we call the Urgency of Science project. And it's an ode to science. It's a call to action to be able to make this case to the public at large, right? And also to our legislators and beyond on the power of science to illuminate, our greatest challenges and the urgency with which we need to invest and devote resources to be able to solve some of those most important problems. And this is, an environment that consider a public good. The goal is to make it a .org site, and to be able to, gather efforts across all the different communities to not only make the case for science, but to also explore the new ways we can accelerate discovery with technology, and that's specific, an important aspect for AI, but in the future quantum. And also the possibilities of creating communities of discovery. So my ask to all of you, if you are persuaded by it, and I know you're all passionate about advancing science and technology, is to consider whether you want to, support this effort, and you can learn more about this. And more importantly, ways perhaps that we can partner and collaborate towards this goal. So thank you. I look forward to the dialogue now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gill. Always inspiring. And the urgency of science is definitely, I think, well heard. I have a few questions, and also I think we have some questions from the audience. Maybe we can take the first one from the audience and then ask more questions myself. So one of the questions that came was that in one of your slides, you showed this evolution from individual to community. And then the question is that some cultures have a different schema. Instead of starting with the individual, they start with the community. And the question is that, what if we designed our AI endeavors not starting with the individual, but starting with the community? And if this is the case, how do you see that?
I think that's an excellent question. And that is a good illustration of the power of diversity, right? And why cultural and geographical diversity and institutional diversity, it is a source of competitive advantage, right, for our societies. So what I think is great. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of a lesson I learned early on. I was talking, a few years back with the president of the Helmholtz Association in Germany, and he was kind of explaining the different models of innovation within the German ecosystem. And he said, look, think about Helmholtz as the equivalent of like NASA or DOE in the context of Germany. You need to build a big scientific instrument, you call us, right? Like you need a particle accelerator or so on, you do that. If you need to reward individual excellence and support that, right, in pursuit of intrinsic knowledge and do that, that's why we have something like the Max Planck, right? There's no scientific agenda that is forced on anybody. You're rewarding the talent of extraordinary people and you'll let them pursue that. And if you want to be much more closer and applied, right, to be able to say, well, how do advances in technology can help industry and so on, you have an environment like the Fraunhofer Institute around that. And the lesson I took out of that is that the institutional diversity of it is a source of strength. So I think in that spirit of a community-oriented endeavor, all I would say is like, I think it's indispensable. I'm a passionate believer that more and more of the challenges we're going to confront is going to be designed around communities of discovery. And that, of course, within that, there's going to be individual, researchers and scientists and exceptional, but that the orientation with which we look at the world, when we look at from the world of community, is going to be a source of tremendous value and opportunity.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. I'm going to read it for you. The question is that, is there any ongoing effort to use AI combined with nanotechnology to combat COVID-19 as an alternative to vaccines? And the second part is, does the possibility exist at the current time? This would be useful if vaccines become elusive, like the HIV vaccine that is unavailable after 50 years since the disease emerged. So long question.
Yeah. Let me see if I can parse it a little bit. Ultimately, of course, I mean, we all know, and we've been, reading, right, and following the case that, like, vaccines are not inevitable, right? HIVs are a wonderful example of the challenges of being able to, ultimately we found ways to be able to do therapies and treatment, but not a vaccine, right? So I think in this case, the nature of coronaviruses and, they don't mutate that fast. So I think they are this good, I would say, optimism that it is going to be possible to create a vaccine for the coronavirus. How long is it going to take is, of course, one of the greatest scientific races in history to be able to accomplish that task. So, but I think I'm optimistic that will occur. Now, were it not to happen, then of course, in parallel, there's very significant effort around therapies, right? And ways to be able to drive treatment such that, in its worst case, it can become something like the flu, right? That you have to be able to deal with it and adapt to it, but you cannot eradicate it. And the reality is, like, we're going to have it present with us for a long time, but we're going to be able to also treat by therapies or anything. And then the topic of nanotechnology, I look at more as an element of that's a horizontal platform. It's a core capability. So aspects that have to do with advances on imaging and small molecule design and binding, of course, take the advantage of all the expertise and knowledge we have in our technology and and chemistry that is being put to the use of developing new treatments and vaccines, without a doubt.
Two or three more questions. I think we have time to. Going back to what you referred about indigenous communities, the question is that, how are you referring to the leadership of indigenous communities and indigenous and traditional knowledge in the development of AI systems?
Sorry, how am I referring to?
The involvement and leadership of indigenous communities and traditional knowledge and their traditional knowledge in the development of AI systems.
Oh. I don't know that I have a tremendous amount of expertise to add, but one interesting example that perhaps has a connection to the question is that within the context of work we have sponsored as part of the COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium, there has been very interesting approaches of different treatment and medical approaches and and chemistries that happen naturally in the context of plants that have come out of India. And that they wanted to then use the role of computation and simulation to be able to validate whether some of those traditional treatment approaches would be viable or conducive to some form of therapy. So if you look at the website, there's some work related to that I think has been, very, very interesting. So perhaps it's like I don't think a great answer to your question, but just a connection of being able to tie different forms of knowledge that are present in different communities to common needs.
Yeah, it seems that as you well highlighted, the need for communities of discovery, connecting different cultures, different approaches might also be one of the challenges, because we don't have it seems that we don't, besides the scientific method and open science, we don't have a method to integrate different critical thinking approaches that comes from different backgrounds and culture weaved into the scientific method. And so that's probably an observation. You made a comment about the fact that we're going to be one day having millions of qubits available, at least in a couple of years, maybe close to 1,000 qubits. So it's amazing to see that some problems can actually be considered solvable when we reach that momentum in terms of computing power, infinite power. So there seems to be a seemingly paradox, which might not be one, between needing communities to work together and infinite power that will be able to solve it anyways. So is this a paradox, or is this a complementary approaches that we need to solve for?
I think they're complementary approaches, and I look at it as a triangle that is connected, right? On this, I look at the possibilities of intelligent infrastructure for the future, combining AI and quantum, and the power of that infrastructure as an instrument, as a scientific instrument for this, is going to be awesome, right? And really remarkable what's going to happen. The other, sort of vertex is the communities of discovery, which is the scientists and the people with the expertise and the knowledge they have and the ways of mobilizing their institutions to tap onto that new scientific instrument. And at the sort of like the pyramid at the top of the triangle is the accelerated discovery workflow, right? That involves with these 4 steps of ways to enhance the knowledge that we have from the past, the deep search and the knowledge representation. The second step on intelligent simulation, right, which is where the intelligent infrastructure comes in, is the world of AI and quantum to simulate and create these virtual experiments. The third step is hypothesis generation, which is the creativity piece, which again, generative models is a good example. And the final step is to what degree can technology help us with automated experimentation, right? The validation, which is a central element of science, which is you conduct experiments and then you see whether what you've had in your head or your theories are actually work or not. And so I see them as complementary. I'm not one of these believers that just technology itself, it's all going to be automated and we can just lie in a hammock and it's all going to be done. I don't think that that's how the future is going to pan out.
Yeah, one might think that aggregation of knowledge could be facilitated by technology. Not that technology will replace humans, but it could be aggregated by computing. And the need for collaboration might not be needed as much as each person could be a node of a global knowledge network. And with sharing of knowledge everywhere, it will dissolve itself into a global, maybe reserve, as you called it, that could be always on call, always available, and we collectively solve problems.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely, that's a very interesting thought, right? The relative weight that on those two ends and the possibilities that you've articulated, I think that's really interesting, and definitely it's a possible future. Yeah, no doubt.
So one more question is about when you mentioned the communities of discovery, how far do discovery goes? Is it identifying the problem, or is it solving for something? And
it has to be. Great question. It has to be. I'm also a big believer that you gotta close the loop, right? Because ultimately, especially in my hat as a special government employee, I serve on the National Science Board as an example in the United States. It's like if you're asking your fellow citizens to invest on science, they will do so to intrinsically advance knowledge, and there's a certain level that society is willing to do that. But they're much more willing to do it on top of that if you close the loop. If you say, hey, we really have a lot of these problems, right? In terms of like health and public health and economic opportunity and climate change. And I think they do want to demand of us as scientists and technologists that we engage in discovery, and that we got to do that 100% and super important, but that we make every effort possible to make sure that our discoveries see the light of day, and that we actually solve the problems that we claim we could solve. So I think that that's absolutely key. And then that leads to a conclusion that I think this world of the answer is only one type of institution, a lab or academia or industry. It's the part where we're seeing this as a zero-sum game, and it's mistaken. What we really need to be able to figure out to do is how we're going to all work together, right? And there are mechanisms. This is not like a highfalutin thing. There are actual mechanisms and creativity in which we can come together to work so that we each bring our strengths and we deliver what society really wants of us.
I think you're resonating now with this community of impact researchers that are trying to solve global challenges and problems, where we learned over the past few years that there is a missing element, which was this connection between those who live the problems, who are facing them on a daily basis, whether it's COVID or a hurricane or injustice or sickness or any form of problem that society faces, and those who have the ability to discover and find pathways, but there is no conversation between the two. And so this connecting between the problem owners, as we call them, and the problem solvers could magically come together with your approach of creating those communities of discovery and solving. So they can do both, because I think part of the knowledge could come back from solving.
That's right.
And if that part doesn't come back, part of discovery, right, is probably staying not shared, as Joshua was saying, that knowledge is not shared fully. And with more power, computing power, probably we can enable more people to be part of this community.
I could not agree more. And when you are connected to the people that actually are encountering these problems and living with them, it is the best insulation to a form of hubris that can be present sometime in our community, where you leave the connecting the dots as an exercise to the reader. And everybody who has been engaged in solving problems in the real world, we all appreciate immediately the complexity and the challenge in doing that. And therefore, the best approach is the mutual appreciation that all of the stakeholders are going to be needed to get that done, very much like you said so. And if not, you talk at a certain level, but you're not actually engaging to the actual problem solving that is going to be required. And by the way, as you correctly pointed out, in that engagement and in that problem solving, you get inspired to solve new problems that lead you to new discoveries and new fundamentals. So it's reinforcing and valuable.
I think that's an awesome way to leave us with a parting thought. I think it was very inspiring, Dario, and we are at time, but I encourage the audience to continue the conversation on Slack and ask questions and then continue the discussions. And we have a number of links to share that you provided with us, Dr. Gill. And I hope this is the first step in a longer conversation, and we can probably participate in becoming part of this reserve to solve grand challenges. Whether
by all means, right? This is all a common good project. So let's do that together. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gill. It was a pleasure. Well, we have a few rest of our program for all of you. I'm going to turn back to Fred Werner, who's going to give us the rest of the agenda for today. We have had this wonderful inspiration about collaboration and participation. So we have a little bit of collaboration left today. We have an amazing project that comes from the breakthrough tracks. And I'll let Fred take over. Fred, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amir, and thank you for the excellent job moderating and all of your good questions. And also thank you to the audience, from whom many of the questions were taken. And last but not least, a special thank you to Joshua and Dario for the excellent presentations. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. But now it's time to get to work. When I mean work, it's not a bad thing. It's actually a lot of fun. We're going to be moving to 3 parallel breakthrough rooms. The first one will be starting in about 9 minutes, and that would be the gender equality breakthrough track. So that starts at 10 a.m. Pacific time and 7 p.m. Geneva time. And you can see the schedule on the screen now, and we'll be pasting all of the registration links in the chat as well. And also keep in mind, if you already registered yesterday or the day before, it's the same link, so you don't need to re-register. Just dig up that email and connect through in that way. We have the Future of Food session. That's at 10:15 Pacific time and 7:15 p.m. Geneva time. And the Pandemic Intelligence track at 10:30 Pacific time and 7:30 p.m. Geneva time. Once again, if you haven't registered, go into the chat, click on the links, register, and that will take you to the Zoom rooms. And if you did, you can use your existing registration link. Finally, I'd like to thank all of the partners and sponsors, and especially our co-convener, Switzerland, for all of their support in making this happen. And I'd like to thank you all, and I think we have time for a quick coffee or a glass of water, and I'll see you all in the breakthrough rooms in a few minutes. Thank you, and good evening.